Thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone for having me over. So I'll be talking about Firebase and Aurelia, but more on the Aurelia side than the Firebase side. So feel free, if you're here just to see Firebase, after the Firebase bit, you can kind of duck out if you feel like you need to. But yeah, so let's go.
One short notification. We have a throwable microphone. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. He will throw the microphone at you, or nicely at you. And that's for your face. So that's for the audio for online audience.
See how many people we can knock out. And yeah, that's one thing I like to say, any questions you have, just kind of throw them at me as you go and we'll throw something at you. So yeah, I feel it keeps the talk more interactive and stops people from falling asleep, particularly after kind of a long day at work and pizza and that kind of stuff. So who am I? I'm Sean, I'm from Melbourne, Australia. So 22-hour flight over to Europe. I've been kind of, not just for this talk, fortunately. That would be a bit too much. I'm dedicated to Aurelia, but not quite that dedicated. So yeah, I was in Lisbon for the last week, and I thought, why not come over? And it's always nice to meet other people kind of doing Aurelia development and things like that. So came over. Most people, when you talk about Australia, they know about a few things, mainly things that can kill you. I have probably 2 out of 3 of those in my backyard, and when I go out for a surf on the weekend, you sometimes encounter the third. But I would still recommend coming for a visit. If you haven't been to Melbourne, come check it out, and ping me up on Twitter, and I'll give you a bit of a tour. Past Aurelia projects. So how did I kind of get started with Aurelia? I think it's interesting for context. I won't dwell too much on it, but back in, I think, 2015, we were looking at starting a new project. We had a back-end system with a whole bunch of microservices, and we needed to kind of instrument them, kind of view what they were doing, but also be able to we okay? Okay. Back to the presentation. So what we ended up doing, we looked around at a few different frameworks, Angular, React. I really liked the look of Aurelia, just in terms of the simplicity, convention over configuration, things that I'm sure that all of you kind of already know about Aurelia, but there was kind of a lot of things that attracted us to the framework. So we kind of embarked on a project, and in a month or so we had something up and running. Started out with managing about 6 servers, and now I just dropped in on the team that work on this project still, and they're now managing about kind of 32 servers, I think, through this UI. So I thought it was pretty cool, and they've themed it in dark, which I thought was amazing, because as a developer, I always work in kind of dark background, so I thought that was pretty cool change. We started working with Aurelia when it was kind of, I would say, young, maybe a little immature. It was kind of in the early alpha phase. So when we started working with it, you could see kind of what to do wrong by looking at GitHub issues, but there wasn't really much on how to do things right. So I think it's really cool that today they've got the new docs site, which makes things a lot easier. And also the Discourse. So I say, like, anyone, if you haven't seen the Discourse, I'd definitely recommend checking it out. Nowadays, getting started is a lot easier. You can kind of jump on, and there's always really interesting discussions happening there. Some of the content from this talk is taken from my book, Aurelia in Action. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll show a discount code, and there's also some free book giveaways as well. So I'll kind of go through that later in the talk. So this talk has kind of 3 key themes, things to kind of take away. So the main themes are SPA authentication. Okay, we're in a different world than what I started in kind of back 8 years or so ago when I first started web development, when we had kind of client-server based authentication with cookies. now things need to be done in a different way. So I'll give a bit of context on that. I'll then kind of take you through Firebase, mainly the authentication and authorization options. I'll show you how to set up some simple authentication in an Aurelia application. And then finally, we'll look at kind of end-to-end, how do you build authentication into an Aurelia application? What are some of the tools that the framework provides that you can use to hook up authentication and authorization in a way that's really like simple and easy, which is always the theme with Aurelia. So out of interest, who's kind of doing single page app development today? Everyone, that's fantastic. And who's using Aurelia today? Just about it, that's fantastic. So I'm speaking to the right crowd. So I won't talk about this too much, but just to kind of say, we've in the old approach where we had client-server authentication, we had to send cookies back and forth between the client and server. If we wanted to save the state on, say, a server farm or something like that, we would then have to save the session that was generated in the database, which created a lot more overhead, more complexity. So even though kind of moving to single-page app development has forced us into a different way of doing authentication, we can't really use cookies anymore. It's actually come with some benefits. So the method that I'm going to be talking about today is JSON Web Tokens. So instead of sending, doing a post to the server and getting a cookie back with a session ID that you send on each request, you now kind of do a post and retrieve a token. And that token doesn't just have an ID, it actually has context. So it should have everything that you need on both the client and the server side without needing to, say, store anything in the database. So it's a stateless model. You can handle server farms for free, and it also means that you don't have to do yet another request to get all of the extra user credentials and claims and things like that, because they're already a part of the token. So yes, it's kind of a change, but I think we got a lot of benefits from that. Who's kind of worked with JSON Web Tokens? Show of hands. Fantastic. So there's a bit of knowledge there, which is good. So probably some of you know a lot more than I do. I kind of know just enough about JSON Web Tokens to be dangerous. Basically the idea is it's kind of like an envelope that contains your username. You generally wouldn't have the password as I've got in this sample. That's an example of something you don't want to put in a token. But things like claims, like the admin value there, and some basic details. We see this is a claim for Gandalf. You might see a theme. My past development team, there was kind of an obsession with Lord of the Rings, and so I kind of continue it through my examples. But basically the idea is you take the details about the user, and then you basically sign them and send them to the server. You basically create a signature with a private secret that you have on the server, then send it back, and then the client then sends the token back to you. You then basically use that signature that you generated on the server side to basically verify that the token hasn't been manipulated on the client side. Because as you know, it's very easy to grab that token, manipulate it, add some claims, toggle yourself to admin, send it back. So you need to basically, on the server side, verify that the token hasn't been manipulated, and that's what that signature is for. Okay, and this is an example of how that might be done. So this isn't using Firebase, this is just a simple node example. So in this case, we get a token and we sign it initially. So that's the first part of that workflow. And then after, the next time a request comes in, might be a request to retrieve some data from the server or something like that, we actually verify that token with our secret, which is probably saved on config file on the server or something like that, and send it back. And that way, if someone is malicious, manipulates the token on the client side and sends it back, we're going to compute a different value, and it's going to throw up an error. So it's a way that we can make sure the token is actually secure. So when I think about authentication, I kind of get one of these like shivers, like when you've been doing development for a while, you get sick of building the same things again and again and again. Particularly things that when they break can cause severe problems for you and your users. So these days we don't necessarily need to do that. There's lots of good options. These are 3 of them. So the one on that side, can anyone yell it out? On the far side there? That's right, Azure AD, which is really nice. Kind of nice in that you can use it to connect kind of on-prem identity to a cloud-based auth system. So it kind of gives you a nice hybrid model there. Auth0 actually provides you with the ability to hook up a number of different authentication systems, and also works very well with Aurelia. There's a number of good examples if you look for that one. I've talked to people that have used it very successfully on a number of projects. And the last one you see there is Firebase, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yeah. So Firebase, in a nutshell, is it basically gives you the ability to just really think about the client-side development. And it does this by providing a number of services out of the box at just the right abstraction level. It's backed by Google, Platform as a Service. It was actually acquired by Google recently, I believe. And it's kind of similar to the functionality that Azure provides, but in my opinion, a lot of it is just easier to get up and running with. Some of the things that it provides, schemaless database, which is nice, really easy. You can just throw data in there to get started. It also provides you with the ability to add validation rules to that data. So schemaless is nice when you're getting started, and this Firebase is being picked up by a lot of startups as they're starting to build new apps, which is great. But once you actually go live, you want to have the right kind of validations in place to make sure you're not corrupting your database. So Firebase allows you to actually add validation rules to the data going in. So say validate that even say a postcode is a valid postcode, things like that, to make sure you've got the data integrity there. Authentication and authorization. Today I'm going to mainly talk about the authentication piece. I'll demo that. And I'll talk briefly about how you might tackle the authorization piece. Hosting, monitoring, more, basically everything that you need to get started with an app. So you really kind of just need to, you're going to spend most of your time building out the client side and hopefully less time managing the server side and infrastructure and that kind of thing. Okay. So yeah, as I said, this is kind of be the main focus, authentication and authorization. Here you go. Thank you. Okay, so to get started, as with everything great on the web these days, it's just one npm install away. So just install the Firebase Tools, CLI, and you're ready to go. One tip I found after I installed the CLI and tried to get going, I'd run the Firebase commands and they just wouldn't do anything, or they'd give an error. It wasn't immediately obvious, but Stack Overflow told me you just add it to your npm path. It's not clear why the install doesn't do that already. I think it's something that their team might be working on, but for now, just adding that path is a good way to get started quickly. So to get started, in the Firebase console, which I'll go to now, basically create a new project. And once you do that, just click the Add Firebase to your web app button. And this brings up some details. I'll change these keys and whatnot after the presentation, but you can see it's just some basic details that Firebase needs to hook up your client-side app to the server-side. So in a minute, I'll show you, how we actually add this to our Aurelia app, but this part is going to become important. You can also create the application through the Firebase CLI. So the Firebase CLI allows you to do app creation, initial creation, deployment. You can deploy your entire app, or with Firebase Functions, which is a way of, it's similar to AWS Lambda or Azure Functions, you can actually deploy just an individual function as well, which is quite nice. So the basic steps are create. In the Aurelia world, I typically start with the Aurelia CLI. You could also start with a skeleton application or something like that, whatever is your preferred way of getting started with an application. So create the app, add the Firebase configuration, and that's just that bit that we saw on the previous, when we went into the console, and then set up the auth service. And that's really all you need to do. So we'll go through kind of each of those steps. Firstly, the AU new command. Out of interest, how many of the audience using the Aurelia CLI? Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. It's cool to see. I think the CLI has come like an amazing strides in the last year or so. The next thing to do is change the Firebase or add the Firebase config settings. You're going to add those to your index.html file typically for your Aurelia app, and then set up the auth service. So I'm going to go to my sample app. So this is just a simple application. Let me get the right one. I'll just have a look. Here we go. Okay, so just going to, so this probably looks very familiar to anyone that's created an Aurelia CLI application before. So all we've done, firstly, under the app, under the body node, just adding a link to the Firebase library. So there's the Firebase, with Firebase, there's two main libraries. There's the client-side one and the server-side one. So for the Aurelia app, you really just need the client-side one. If you're going to add authorization as well, then you'll also need to add the server-side library and configure that with functions. The next thing you're going to do is change the configuration values. So that basically hooks up to the project that you've just created on the Firebase console. And then just call the Firebase library initialize app function, which actually hooks your application up to the server side using the config settings. So yeah.
Can you delay this, that you first start your application, you get your first screens, and then do the initialization?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Can you delay the initialization?
Delay the initialization?
So you first get your application up and running, and then in the background start doing these things.
Yeah. So you can. I haven't actually tested that myself. I assume that you would be able to do that. What I've tried so far is just spin up the connection straight away. But I could imagine putting that behind kind of a promise or something like that I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to do that later. So any other questions? I feel like it'd be good to throw a box around. Yeah.
I was wondering if this also should be some kind of package you can install in Aurelia for Firebase, because you use the CDN here.
Yeah. So I think there is an Aurelia Firebase package. So from what I saw, it hasn't been updated recently. So I would just, I would check probably to see, how recent it is. For me, it was simpler just to because the steps are so simple, it's only a couple of lines. I thought avoid the added dependency and just chuck it in. I kind of try to do that wherever possible to avoid adding extra dependencies. Also with Aurelia, because it's such so close to native JavaScript or TypeScript, a lot of the time you can kind of get away without it. So that's kind of what I try to do. But yeah, no, it's a good question. I think there is, but I think it's called Aurelia Base or Aurelia Firebase or something like that. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Okay. Well, we haven't managed to take anyone's head off yet while asking questions, so that's always a good thing. Yeah. Well, not enough beers yet, obviously. Okay. So the next thing that we need to do is add the auth service. So the auth service, actually, we'll approach it from the AppView model because that's probably the easiest way to see it. So basically, all we're doing at the start is we're taking an auth service in the constructor, all pretty basic. I'll come back to this bit in a minute. But basically, what I'll do is I'll show the application now, and then I'll come back to this so that you can see kind of how it's working. Okay, here we go. So just a simple application allows you to log in with various auth providers, in this case, Google+, Twitter, or Facebook. There's a number of other auth providers that you can hook up. So if we go back to the Firebase console and go to authentication and sign-in method, so you can actually set up email and password. And when you do that, it's actually interesting. They give you a number of templates that you can use. So so then Firebase will send out your password kind of reset email, your registration email, and things like that for you, which is quite handy. Obviously, you don't need those kind of email templates for something like Google or Facebook, because those auth providers are going to handle those concerns for you. But it's nice that they've got that option as well. GitHub, so all the kind of major auth providers are supported, and it's just a matter of kind of enabling them there. So you don't really need to do any extra work, which is kind of really nice time saver. So then if we look back here, so I'll pick Google+, and my email address. And there you go, I've logged in. So that's actually made a request through to the Google authorization or authentication service. And really there, I didn't need to wire up anything. It was the Firebase client API that was doing all of the heavy lifting for me. With Google, there's not really any extra setup. You just enable it in the console and that's it. With Twitter and Facebook, there's a little bit of extra work you have to do just to add your app API keys. So if you've ever hooked up Facebook or Twitter to do any integration work before, it's just a similar thing to add your API key and authorize it. But that's all you really need to do. And then log out. So it's pretty simple. How's that actually working under the hood? So when we click the login button, it's using something called the auth service, passing in the type, which might be Twitter, Google, what have you. and then we're getting a promise back which contains the auth details. So they're the auth details that we're going to retrieve back from the authentication provider like Google or whatnot. And taking that down one layer, so we log in. First thing we do, we get the auth provider, and we've got a number of those supported. Google, Facebook, or Twitter, just to do a few. You could do that you could probably reduce the boilerplate code there a bit, but that's kind of what you get out of the box with the samples. And this is really just using that same Firebase API that we initialized in the index.html. From there, once we know which provider we're actually going to sign up with a pop-up. So the provider-specific pop-up, which again the API kind of provides for you. And from there, you're going to get an auth token, which is going to be sent with each request through to the Firebase API, and then any user credentials that you want to show on the screen. So the details like when we logged in, so do that again. So details like email, anything like that that's available. I think only really email, display name are available from those auth providers, because obviously the API gives you something that's common across all the auth providers. So there's be some things that you might get back from Facebook that you might not get back from Google. So it kind of tries to standardize between those. And then that's kind of returned back to the app, and we just set it on the view model and display it. And just for completeness, to show you the other side of that, all we're doing is this is the app view. So just a click delegate to log in. It's hitting the app view model, passing through to the auth service, and doing the login there. So pretty simple. Any questions on the authentication side of things before we move on to authorization? No? He's good. Yeah, excellent.
There you go,
Wonder
man.
if how you implement pressing F5. Do you remain logged in, or how does it work?
Yeah, that's a good question actually, and that's something that I skipped over. So what happens when you refresh the page is the API actually fires an event. So you get this on-state changed event, and when you get that event, it basically checks for the user. The way that it stores it between sessions, so that's how it basically brings it back up in your Aurelia application. The way it actually handles that under the hood is if we do an inspect and go to the application, it's storing the Firebase detail connection, or the JWT really, in here. And if we actually take a look at this token, it's actually pretty straightforward. I've got an example of that I pulled out before. And so this is what it's storing in local storage. So when you hit F5, it's actually the API is going and retrieving this from the browser. Does that without you needing to do anything. You just hook into that event and check that it's actually brought that user back up for you, and then from there you're good to go. So it's all just kind of local storage and the API helping you again by raising an event. Cool. Okay. Great question. Okay, so that's kind of as simple as the authentication side of things is.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, what happens when you press F5 after the expiration date time expires?
I haven't tested that, but yeah, it's a good question.
Open?
Yeah.
It's 1 hour or something?
Yeah.
After that, what will happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I assume that you would get an event saying from that event that we saw, saying that you weren't. Yeah, so you'd have to you'd have to handle that yourself within the Aurelia application. So you would get basically an event. It would say that the user wasn't signed in. You'd then have to basically sign them out using the Firebase API.
Would there refresh tokens or?
So the refresh token would still stay in local storage. I haven't seen mine get removed in the testing, but it would be an expired token. So the server side, so the Firebase server would basically would actually verify that it was expired, return you an invalid response. So you get an invalid response, you get an event raised, I think, from the Firebase client API. Then you'd have to handle that, log the user out and redirect them. So so it will basically give you the plumbing, I think, for it, but you'll actually have to handle the client side of it, on your own inside the app, which I guess makes sense because everyone's going to want to handle how they kind of move the users around differently. Like in one application that we do, we show a modal dialog when that happens, and another one we just force them back to the login page.
But let's say you put the expiration date on 15 minutes, you still be working on it. Can you refresh
the token?
I'll be working 15 or 40 minutes, 59 seconds, and then kabang.
Yeah, you're out. Yeah. So, I'd have to check the docs. Yeah,
interacting with the interface.
My understanding is there should be a way of doing that. The way I've done it when I've implemented it myself in the past, the libraries tend to provide a refresh token mechanism. So I assume that this client library has a similar thing. But I have to check the docs to be sure. But it would make sense because you obviously don't. You want to be able to refresh that token. You don't want to be knocked out after half hour, particularly if you're filling out like a massive form, like you go through, like a project.
One day, 2 days or so, it will be big enough to complete the survey or whatever you're doing. But
Exactly. Yeah. Well, my brother works for the Australian Heart Foundation, and they have forms that will take people kind of days to fill out. So like imagine, exactly. Imagine you get partway through that, it kicks you out. So with those kind of scenarios, obviously you'd want to be saving the state to the server side as you go, and then you'd have something to get back to that state. But definitely you want to have something to handle refresh tokens as well. Yeah.
There's no interaction with the server. If you have this form, this gigantic form already on your screen, it's on the client side, and you're just happily typing in, and you're not sending anything to the server. Then that's the hard part. What I did for the standard case is just give a new token when the half of the expiration time is over. So just get a fresh one while you're still here, But if you're out of luck, then you just are 1 second behind, and then miss your window, and then you still have to log in again. There's not really so much you can do unless you want to give up the whole stateless mechanism and keep state on the server, which is exactly what you don't want.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not easy, and there's kind of patterns that you can do to make the user experience less painful, I guess. But at the end of the day, that's one of those tricky problems, I guess. So okay, great questions. Thank you. Keep them coming. So could we take this Firebase stuff further? Yes. So we've only kind of scratched the surface of what you could do there. So with Firebase functions, what you can do is they give you basically triggers. So for example, when a user registers, do something. When a user logs in, do something. There we go. Yes. Obviously. Obviously my token was expired and it booted me out. So basically, what we could do there is when a user registered, Firebase gives you the option of adding claims to that user. And those claims could then be used for authorization and things like that. I haven't added those in my demo, but looking at it, it doesn't look to be that difficult. Additional auth methods. So we set up some basics with Google, Twitter, and Facebook, but as you saw, there's more that we could do. The neat thing about this is that you don't need to completely opt into the Firebase ecosystem in order to adopt just the Firebase auth stuff. So you could have a custom, say, Node REST API and just pass the authentication piece off to Firebase, which is nice. They've got ways of kind of managing that. And to do that, you'd take a dependency on the Firebase server API. Yeah, good question.
How would you go about authorization-wise with this? I don't really understand how this clicks with the different types of logins that you have. For instance, if you have some kind of role or account type or whatever you want to call it, you have to set this up beforehand. Some admin person has to say, okay, Sean is a nice guy, he gets a lot of rights, and I don't like that guy very much, so he gets very little rights. So how does that work? Because you have to prepare that, and you have to sort of attach it to some sort of known identity, but you can choose from a whole bunch of identities.
That's right, yeah. So the claims basically get stored in the Firebase database. So you would still, if you had a custom, say, REST API, you'd still need to opt into the Firebase database just to store the claims associated with that identity, because obviously you want those stored with the identity because you don't want that to be able to manipulate that somewhere else, because then the token becomes invalid. So that piece you'd need to take a dependency on.
At what time does the identity actually goes into existence? Is that the moment where you decide, okay, I'm going to use my Google Plus login and then log in first, and then you get your rights? It's not the other way around, right?
Yeah, so when you basically log in to the application for the first time, what it does, have a look at the console, is it basically registers your identity in the console here. That also raises that register event that I was talking about, and you can hook into that via a Firebase function. When that happens, you've got the identity, so you can add the claims. Those claims then get stored against the user in the database. So when you check the database here, any claims that are added to users, you'll kind of see added to this Firebase database here. And then the way that authorization works is those claims are then tied to rules. So the rules determine for a particular user they can do this thing. So it's kind of spread it into kind of different parts. So the identities are housed, they're managed in Firebase. They're created when you register. That identity by default won't have any claims associated with it. You need to do that yourself. When you associate claims with that identity, then that identity is tied to a particular user ID. So say me on Facebook and me on Twitter are two different things. There may be a way of joining those identities, but I haven't seen that yet. So then, the claims are in the database. They're tied to a particular user ID. Then if you implement a custom REST API, then when you receive the token from the client side, you would make a call through to the cloud API to actually verify the token's validity and things like that. So that's kind of how the different pieces of it fit together.
So it's a two-stage process. The initiative is at the user to just register himself.
That's right.
Assign rights and everything.
That's right, yeah. So the examples I've seen are typically done when the user registers. So you'll do it based on some kind of rule or something like that. And then you could also develop a UI for assigning claims. But that UI would have to be, you'd have to develop that separately. There's nothing that Firebase gives you out of the box to do claims management and things like that. It gives you all the building blocks, but it doesn't give you like a pre-built thing to just go and work with it.
And you have to make sure that you're going to use the same identity from that point onwards, because if you next week decide to use Facebook or Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Then you're a new person. So yeah, That's right. But yeah, I imagine there's probably a way of, of joining them up. But I know that was what kind of a lot of service providers initially had trouble with, because people would, I think even Stack Overflow maybe when they started up, because people would sign in with one account, they'd go to another one and then raise a ticket with help desk saying, where's all my stuff gone? Yeah, it's not you, it's the other you. So yeah, it's confusing. Okay, so taking things further, now we're going to get into the more Aurelia specific side of things. So with Aurelia, you guys have probably covered a lot of these in the past, but I just think it's kind of worth exploring different tools that Aurelia gives you that makes an authentication system possible. So when I kind of thought about it and listed them out, there's the auth service that you need, an interceptor, a pipeline step, a value converter, and a layout. And with those things, you can just about do what you want with auth. So the auth service basically serves as a glue. So this is what's going to basically hook up, and I'll actually dive into the code for this as well. So this is a separate sample application. If I can get to the right version. Yep. So the auth service is what's going to basically bring most of the different pieces together. It's what's going to handle your token interception and things like that. If we go back to our model from earlier in the presentation, just to kind of have an overview again. So the workflow basically goes like this. We post a token to the server, and the way that we do that is, one way of doing that would be to send, say, post a username and password, and we get an access token back. That token then gets stored, and we'll walk through this workflow as we go, with more help from our friends at Lord of the Rings. So we've logged in. And what that's done, actually, when we logged in, is it would have sent a request to the server and retrieved a token. That token is then similar to what we saw with Firebase. It's actually stored right next to it, stored in local storage. So then we need a way of making sure that token is actually sent along with every request. Who can name the Aurelia feature that you would use to do that? Interceptor. That's right. Yep. So you use an interceptor, which is going to basically intercept the request and attach a bearer header along with the request. Following that, the next thing that happens is we need to decide what to actually display in the menu. So we've got different menu items. We want to make sure that admin users don't actually see, so that admin users see the admin menu, standard users don't. So a feature of the Aurelia framework that's really handy for this is value converters. So if we have a look, with a simple value converter, we can basically filter over each of the routes and check to make sure that the user use the auth service, which we're using as glue, to make sure that the user's an admin, and then filter out the list of routes that we're actually going to return to make sure that the user only sees the routes that they're authorized to see. And jumping back to list. So we intercept the request, append the bearer token, which we've retrieved from local storage. And the next thing actually that I missed was a pipeline step. So hands up who's worked with routing pipeline steps before. Fantastic, everyone. Okay, that's good. So everyone is already pro at this, so that's fantastic. So basically, Aurelia provides a number of cross-cutting pipeline steps. These are used to make sure that you don't need to implement the same kind of operations in every view across your application. The one that is probably used most is authorize, but there's also other ones like pre-activate and things like that. So why not just add something like this to the can activate lifecycle step, component lifecycle step? We could do that, but the don't repeat yourself police says no. We don't want to do that in every view in our application because it's just going to create too much boilerplate code. And with Aurelia, we want to steer clear of boilerplate code, obviously. So what we want to do, use a pipeline step. Next thing, we use a value converter. This is used to guard against unauthorized access by filtering out all of the routes that we don't want people to see. You've seen an example of that. And layouts. So layouts are actually quite convenient. So if you notice, go back to this application, and when we're logged in, we see the navigation menu. But when we're logged out, we see a completely different view. So one of the things that Aurelia allows you to do is define different layouts, and you can think of these as similar to your MVC layouts. So where with MVC you might have a layout for, say, a login page, a different layout for the rest of the application. You can do the same thing with Aurelia actually. And the way that you define them is when you're configuring the router, you can define particular routes and link them to particular layouts. So in this example, I've got two layouts. I've got a main layout, and I've also got a login layout. That's kind of linked. The frustrating thing is you can't define like a default layout. It would be nice if you could define, say, I want my routes to by default use the main layout, and then only override it to use a different one on, say, the login page. You can't do that as yet, but that'd be a cool feature, I think. So if we have a look at the login layout, this basically uses some different styles, and it also uses layouts allow you to define slots, which actually use the shadow DOM under the hood. Have you guys used shadow DOM slots in layouts before? Yeah. So I think that's kind of a really nice way that Aurelia leverages the features of the shadow DOM and web component specifications to actually make that kind of nice and easy. Okay. That's where we see different layout for login, different layout for the main view. What this means is we don't have to have a lot of conditional statements in our layout page. And you've seen the demo. And yeah, thank you everyone for listening to the presentation. Are there any more questions at this stage? Yeah.
These layouts, you type them on in the router viewer, I guess.
Yeah.
You could do with a script, I guess. So you say,
yeah.
When the router name is.
Yeah, that's
login, just use the login and all the others, so you don't have to type right
yeah.
down yourself.
That's a good suggestion. Yeah, reduce the boilerplate code. So yeah, you kind of do it dynamically rather than declaring it all out. So yeah, that'd be a good way of doing it. I like it.
You could write some arrays.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's a good suggestion. So I find the router configuration.
With the activation strategy or something.
Yeah.
First time we wrote it in all views, but you could.
Yeah, exactly. Define just a
all
yeah.
these routes have you should use these strategies.
Yeah, and that would that'd be a much.
All this code from all the views.
That's right. Yeah, and that would be a much more convenient way of doing it. I noticed that the route, it's probably a good thing to tackle on the routing configuration specifically, because I noticed that can get quite bloated. And this is with a small sample app. And it's already kind of, like.
2 routes and then.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Full with the code
Yeah, exactly. So anything. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of a one-liner just to apply it conditionally. So it's good. Good suggestion. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. Fantastic. So there's a discount code available for the book for both the online listeners and people in the audience. And also, if you, my Twitter ID is there. If you follow me on Twitter, I've got 5 free books to give away. So the first kind of 5 people to follow me on Twitter get a free book. Yeah, I don't see people getting their phones out. Come on, guys. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.